I don't know. The problem with the student digs in Nottingham, it wasn't... it was a bit
So
like
did you get in?
Yes, I got in.
And?
I did my 30 years,
Oh,
and
boy.
the vetting process back then...
Last question, and I'm alluding to James's time. Just briefly, your son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter says, I want to join the cops. In a sentence, what would you say, Roger?
No.
That's a short sentence, and it's the last word. Roger, because I'm already over time. I'm sure there are many reasons. Thanks for your call. I'm done. James O'Brien's the other side of the news. I'm with you tomorrow here on LBC. I'm with you tomorrow morning from 7. Meantime, stay safe.
Thank you, Nick. The time is approaching 10 o'clock and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is limbering up outside the studio, preparing to take your calls. The number, as ever, is 0345 6060973. And a word to the wise, if you promise not to tell anybody, the sooner you ring in, the more likely you are to be able to put your question to the Mayor. And it's Thursday as well, so it's Mystery Hour from 12. I could have waltzed into the studio at about 5 to 10 this morning, so little preparation is needed for the programme. But in the middle bit, we will probably return to the vexed question of empty shelves and the so-called pingdemic. If we called it a sovereign app, do you think everyone would suddenly relax about it and pretend that it's a brilliant idea?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation, this is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 10 o'clock, the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng has insisted the rules on self-isolation in England will stay in place until the 16th of August. Supermarkets are facing growing difficulties in keeping their shelves stocked, with so many workers being pinged by the NHS COVID app. Nick Allen, who's Chief Executive of the British Meat Processors Association, says consumers shouldn't panic.
What people are struggling to do is deliver all the lines that they're delivering and deliver against all their orders. So you are going to go into shops and you're going to see gaps on the shelves. There's going to be things there that you'd have liked to have seen there and they're not going to be there. But, as a food supply chain, right through the pandemic, we've managed to keep the nation supplied with food.
The government's expected to publish a list of sectors whose workers will be exempt from isolation rules if they're fully vaccinated. The British Retail Association says the likes of hauliers delivering food supplies should be included. BP says it's had to close some of its petrol stations temporarily because of a shortage of fuel. The company says the main reason is a lack of qualified lorry drivers, but that a distribution terminal has been closed for a few days because of the number of people self-isolating. Ministers insist the 3% pay rise for NHS staff in England and Wales is fair because of the economic cost of the pandemic. The government's accepted the recommendation of an independent review, but unions say the increase is paltry and they'll look at industrial action. Jeremy Benton is from the Royal College of Nursing.
It's an insult to nurses and all of the nurses who've spent the last 10 years under a pay restraint that's ended up with us being 14% behind where we were in 2010. Of course, it's not fair.
The top US military officer says the Taliban appears to have strategic momentum in the fight for control of Afghanistan. American forces are due to complete their withdrawal from the country by the end of next month. The director of tomorrow's opening ceremony for the Tokyo Olympics has been sacked. Kentaro Kobayashi was dismissed after it emerged he'd made anti-Semitic jokes during a comedy routine in 1998. The government plans to sell off up to another 15% stake in NatWest Group, which was previously Royal Bank of Scotland. It would reduce the taxpayer holding in the bank to as much as 39.7%. In the city a short time ago, the FTSE 100 was trading up 15 points, 70.13, and the pound buys $1.37 and €1.16. And the weather, hot, dry and sunny again for most. Isolated showers may affect parts of Wales and northern and central England, and cloudier for the far north, a high of 31 degrees. From Global's newsroom, I'm Simon Conway.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Speak to Sadiq. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, takes your calls.
And a very good morning to you. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, is in the studio and the phone lines are open. The number you need is 0345 6060973. I will be, as ever, playing Robin to his Batman, so reserving the right to throw in supplementaries and even perhaps to ask a few questions of my own. And we'll start with one of those, Sadiq, if I may. Shortages. What are you hearing? How big a deal is it? And what does the light at the end of the tunnel look like?
It's a big problem across our city. Good morning, James, and good morning to your listeners. Not only in relation to what you've seen in the news today in our shops and supermarkets and supply of food, but I'm also concerned about staff at TfL having to self-isolate because they've been pinged. So you saw this weekend the Met Line having to temporarily close. We've also had examples of the Circle Line. Was it just the
Met Line?
It's also the Circle Line, and yesterday was the Waterloo and City Line. Because control work, people work in the control rooms, those who work in signalling, who've had both doses are being pinged. They're doing the right thing, following the government guidance. So we're talking to the government, James, about whether they're able to extend the exemption scheme. So those key workers across our city, not just in TfL, police, fire, food supplies, if they've had both jabs and they have a negative test, if they can continue working, because if they continue to have these numbers of people being forced to self-isolate, I worry about a number of essential services.
And you're in contact, are you? Because they seem to have changed their mind in the last 48 hours on this. Of course, this week we've learned there's always a danger that within 5 minutes of a senior government minister saying something live on national broadcasting, the government or Downing Street will announce the polar opposite. But Kwasi Kwarteng this morning seemed to be saying that there'll be a list later today.
Yeah.
Is that your information? Is that your understanding?
Correct.
But you don't know exactly who's going to be on it?
Correct.
For example, transport workers.
Spot on. So those conversations are ongoing, and it's really important the government understands the concerns people have. Some
of these concerns, of course, are not linked to the ping, but we'll possibly park that for another day. The BP story there saying it's a lack of unqualified lorry drivers that is explaining why they're not getting delivered. But if you get pinged, you can't be required to go to work, can you? Or would that be the new plan? So people may, either because they fancy a day off in the sun or more likely because they are worried about infection and contagion, they ping, the employer says, well, you can come to work, but it's up to you. It's entirely up to you.
Let's be quite clear, and it's really important to clarify this. There's nothing defective about the app or being rung by Test and Trace. They're doing what they're supposed to do.
Test and Trace is a legal obligation if they contact you.
But they're doing what they're supposed to do, which is they're picking up somebody who's been in contact with somebody tested positive. Yeah. And so what you should be doing, and what you actually must do if you work for me, is self-isolate. What we're trying to do is reach an accommodation with the government. So those essential workers, and this will be no consolation to those businesses who are really struggling, by the way, essential workers that we need, if they are pinged, if they've had both jabs, they do a test. If it's negative, they can then come to work.
But they don't have to.
Well, it depends in relation to the individual circumstances. So somebody could be pinged because they've been in contact with somebody and even though they've had one test, we need to make sure there's a second test. And so it depends who they are and the circumstances. You're right, by the way, and this is where the minister got in difficulties. If you're contacted by Test and Trace, you're required to self-isolate. But I'm quite clear, if you work for me, you self-isolate unless we've done the negative test. There's a separate conversation about whether you can force somebody, and we've got to take a case-by-case basis.
Because, I mean, for anyone in any doubt, because your colleagues can largely work from home. They can be in contact. I mean, it's a white-collar work, isn't it? It's not like delivering, I don't know, truckloads of gammon to supermarkets. Or any other pork product.
Or working in the control room, or working in signalling, or a police officer on the front line, or a firefighter on the front line, and so forth.
Let's go to the phones. Over to you.
Well, the first call I'm really pleased to hear is called Matthew, and I think he's from Heathrow, if I read my notes correctly. Matthew, good morning.
Morning, Sadiq. Yes, I wanted to check, are you thinking of actually introducing vaccine passports for people to travel on Greater London Transport or to have a valid PCR test, say, within 7 days or something? Because I'm concerned about the rise in the COVID levels now, infections.
Well, let's be quite clear. The difference the vaccine makes is huge. It weakens the link between the virus and serious illness. It can reduce hospitalisation by around 90%. That's the good news. I'm not in favour of having vaccine passports within London for TfL. It'd be just a bureaucratic nightmare. I'll give you an example, Matthew. Before the pandemic, we had, roughly speaking, 5 million journeys in our buses, 4 million on our tubes. It's around 70% now on buses, about 45% on the tubes. It simply would be almost impossible for us to get it working without having massive queues leading to big problems. What I'm in favour of is as many Londoners as possible receiving not just one jabs, but both. And the good news, Matthew, is we now have more than 10 million doses administered in London. And the really good news is those above the age of 40, 80% have had both doses. So we've got to encourage the vaccine take-up, but I think it's not realistic to expect us to have vaccine passports within London.
So in an ideal universe, it might be quite a nice idea, but logistically it's the cost-benefit ratio. What sort of equipment or personnel would you have to introduce at every point of egress and ingress to check people's documents or phones?
Yeah, and there's an additional issue about how do you avoid fraud, an additional issue about those who are exempt and those who maybe have had one jab, Matthew, because they're 18, 19, maybe 3-4 weeks ago and are waiting for their second jab, and you're depriving them of a service, even though they've taken precautions, they're not positive, they're wearing a face mask and so forth.
Are you a member of any mysterious pilot scheme? If you were to be contacted by Test and Trace or pinged, would you be able to plead pilot, as we've seen some do, albeit briefly in the last few days?
I can't think of any exclusive clubs I belong to, and not least the one you're referring to.
And by the way, 3 mayors of London, I suppose.
But by the way, actually, on a serious point, I could do my job from home for 10 days if I was asked to self-isolate. I'm far more concerned about shop workers, about transport workers, about police officers, about firefighters. And if there is a scheme to be exempt from self-isolation, if you have both jabs and are tested negative, I'd rather they get on that scheme rather than me.
And staying in a similar theme, you are a Labour mayor of London. What is the Labour Party's policy on vaccine passports for nightclubs come September?
I know my views in relation to the National Labour Party. Yeah. My understanding this morning is that the Labour Party are against the government proposals to bring in vaccine passports from
Do you know
September.
Why?
I'm not sure why.
Okay. So they're against them, but the most powerful Labour politician in the country is not sure why. To be clear, for the benefit of the tape.
I'm quite clear. Nightclub owners and those who run nightclubs have worked incredibly hard to follow the government guidance, the government rules. They've been working with the government in advance of July the 19th. At no stage were they told vaccine passports was on the offing. And my point to the government is, look, if you're doing this as an incentive to encourage young people to receive the jab, let's be honest with young people. And let's find other ways to incentivise young people. But if you're concerned about nightclubs being, inverted commas, super spreaders, why wait till September?
Well, that's an interesting question, obviously, that hopefully someone will ask a government minister at some point. But your personal view on passports, then? If we're not quite sure what the party view is.
I'm not in favour of them.
Not at all?
I think internationally there's a really strong argument for there to be vaccine passports, and I'm in favour of vaccine passports internationally. I think it's possible in the future, once we've had a comprehensive rollout of the vaccines.
Right.
At the moment, we've had full coverage, although...
It's chicken and egg, though, isn't it? Because it is an incentive. It's a huge incentive to people who are just wavering, right? Not people who've fallen down YouTube rabbit holes necessarily, but people who are just wavering.
Oh, but let's have the conversation. No. If that's... I agree, there are things we can do to incentivise take-up. I'll give you one example. We opened up the Tate on Friday night. I want to thank the team at Tate for doing so. We had great culture, great art, great music, and you can get a jab, and thousands turned up. This weekend, Chelsea, Spurs, Oval opened up their grounds. Many sports fans, that was the incentive to go along and get the jab. Science Museum, Battersea Arts Centre and Charlton have been great, and so forth and so forth. So, but let's be honest with Londoners. Don't say, as I suspect many Londoners fear, and nightclub owners fear, is this has all been done to encourage take-up. The nightclubs would invest in technology, and then lo and behold, in September, the government will say, we just did it to encourage take-up. We didn't really mean it and stuff. That's not the way to govern the country.
We shall see. I do want to ask you about masks on public transport, but I'm conscious of taking up too much time. So if anybody wants to get a free pass to the front of the queue on the switchboard, ring in and ask the Mayor about masks on public transport. In the meantime, back to the phones.
Well, let's go from Heathrow to Soho, and I think I've got Anna on the line. Good morning, Anna.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me. I'm on a bog standard phone.
Loud and clear.
Oh, good. That's great. Now, look, when is TfL going to do something about these electric scooters? I wrote a letter to Metro about a month ago. It was the leading letter about them weaving in and out of pedestrians. Now, yesterday I was nearly killed. I was walking down Oxford Street towards Tottenham Court Road, being very aware of what was going on. I always am. I'm not in the flush of youth. And a electric scooter, rode directly at me, not from behind, but from the front, rode at me and missed me by a few millimetres. I got an awful shock, and I said to him, you shouldn't be on the pavements. You just put two fingers up and went on doing the same thing.
Shouldn't be on the road. You shouldn't be on the roads either, actually, I think, technically, Anna, unless it was one of these rented ones. This is a huge problem, Sadiq Khan. Anna has articulated it perfectly. I can see why her letter was given prominence in the Metro. But, of course, we also know that a 3-year-old girl, at the opposite of Anna describing herself as not being in the first flush of youth, a 3-year-old girl has been left with life-changing injuries following a collision in a park in Lambeth. So something's got to give. Is it TfL's responsibility? Whose is it?
No, it isn't. But Anna, let's be quite clear. The government has a law which we support, which says e-scooters are unlawful. They're unlawful on pavements. They're unlawful on roads, and that's the law. And one of the things that police are doing is enforcing the law where they can. Bearing in mind finite resources in relation to those who are riding an e-scooter unlawfully and breaking the law. What's happened, Anna, is because e-scooters have been invented, we can't uninvent them. What the government's doing, and again I support this as well, is saying, look, let's have pilot schemes across the country to see how we rationalise the use of e-scooters in a safe way. So in 8 boroughs across London, 3 companies are hiring out e-scooters, and there's about 1,000 e-scooters across London, and they have a maximum speed limit of 12.5 miles per hour. That you've got to do a test before you can ride one. There's an insurance scheme in place, so we're seeing if it's possible to roll out e-scooters safely, and the pilot takes the course of the next the year. But I don't want anybody to think that is somehow giving the green light to those unlawful e-scooter owners to ride their e-scooters. And you're right, Anna, and not only is it a nuisance to you and potential harm to you, but as James said, we've had a 3-year-old with very, very, very serious injuries. We saw, unfortunately, a 16-year-old, through no fault of his own, losing his life because of an injury from another user on the roads. And so it's really important for there to be no equivocation. E-scooters are against the law. And for those who've been given one as a Christmas present or a birthday present, I'd plead with you not to use them. The only place you're able to use them is a private road. Otherwise, you can't use e-scooters on our roads or our pavements.
Well, this would be really easy to fix, wouldn't it? I mean, I know you'd face the questions about why you're going after e-scooters and not going after murderers or rapists, but you're going to face them whatever you do. You could go out now, just confiscate every single one of them and chuck them all on a massive bonfire in Bermondsey.
And the Met Police Service are. So the Met Police Service have confiscated.
Anna could go out now, walk up Oxford Street and count 100 before she'd got to Selfridges.
I mean, hundreds of e-scooters have been confiscated, hundreds of fines have been given, and the police are having a proportionate response to this big issue. I just make one point, a small point, which is an important one as well to make, James, without in any way trivialising e-scooters and the harm they cause. In a normal year in London, around 150 people die on our roads. About half of those are pedestrians. So there is a wider issue about road safety in London, which is one of the reasons why, more and more across London we have 20 miles per hour roads, which is one of the reasons why we have more safe cycling, one of the reasons why we've widened pavements and so forth. There is an issue of road safety in London.
I suppose if the e-scooters, even if you can't get all the illegal ones off the road, confined themselves to the cycle lanes, a lot of these problems would be avoided in the interim. Anna, if you were in charge, if I made you Mayor of London for the day, what would you do?
Well, I mean, I would just like to see something being done about it. It's all very well going on with all the theorising.
That's why I'm asking. I have a sense you could probably come up with some rather good ideas. I just wondered if you've got any on the tip of your tongue, so to speak.
Well, I mean, I'd like to see they've got security people going around, watching to see that people are not going in more than so many numbers before when we were not allowed to do things.
Yes,
and yet today, now, there's absolutely nobody monitoring what these e-scooters are doing. And I was very, very frightened yesterday.
I'm very sorry to hear that, Anna, and we'll keep a very, very close eye on this, and indeed on the Mayor, on your behalf, because it is... I've been close to being a sort of Wild West scenario, isn't it? And I appreciate what you say about other issues and other dangers, but if people don't feel safe walking on the pavement, then a city that is desperate to tempt tourists back and to reinvigorate a moribund economy is adding an extra burden to its own back.
I've got another call now from Tower Hamlets in London, and it's Jack. Good morning, Jack.
Morning, James. Morning, Sadiq.
Hiya.
How are you doing?
Not bad at all, Jack.
Yeah.
You got a question for me?
Yes, I have. It's about knife crime. To date, we've lost 21 teenagers in London. And as a father of 2 young boys, I'm very concerned as someone who's always lived in London. I spoke to you 12 months ago, heading into the last summer holidays, and you said you was going to tackle this issue, and it's gone in the reverse. What are we going to do, or what are you going to do, and the Commissioner and all the other leaders in London, and James included, because he talks a lot about COVID and stuff, but we don't ever hear about what's happening with teenagers losing their lives. And I think it's something has to happen, and I want to hear your plans as a Londoner.
Thanks.
Before you answer that, as you know, I can't remember a time you've come into this studio, or probably any other studio, to take calls from members of the public, and this is always near the top of the list of issues that people want to talk about. And I'm afraid, Sadiq Khan, 12 months since Jack last said it, probably, 3 years since we first started doing this, or more, actually.
When I first ran to be mayor 6 years ago.
6 years since we started doing this, and very, very little sense from where I'm sitting that anything has improved at all.
Well, let me address Jack's point head on before I deal with your point as a listener. So Jack, James is right when he talks about when I was running to be mayor. I used to talk about this a lot for the obvious reason. My experience as a Londoner, put aside as a parent, was that there was a big increase in serious youth violence and violent crime and people losing their lives across our city. And you mentioned the difference from last year to this year. During the last year, I'm afraid I've met even more bereaved parents who've lost children as a consequence of a knife crime. And so it is a big issue, and we mustn't pretend it's not a big issue. And I've never pretended, by the way, it's not a big issue. This summer we've got 2 big concerns, which is why we've got additional resources in this area. One is the big concern about summer approaching. As you said, Jack, when summer comes, there tends to be an increase in youth violence across our city. Secondly, though, as restrictions are eased, and what we've seen across the globe from Chicago to New York is a big increase in violent crime as restrictions are eased. So a combination of both those things is one of the reasons why we've done 2 big things. One is to deal with suppressing violence by additional police officers, high visibility, particularly in those parts of London, Jack, where we know from our data there is high incidence of youth violence, violent crime, knife crime. And secondly, supporting young people, giving them constructive things to do during the course of this summer in relation to music, sports, performing arts, from angling to basketball and so forth, to keep young people busy rather than getting sucked into criminal activity and violent crime. And by the way, Jack, I don't want to trivialise this, but progress has been made. And so not just before the pandemic, but now we have seen a reduction in youth violence, a reduction in knife crime, a reduction in gun crime, but teenage homicides this year have gone up. And that's a big source of concern for both the police, myself, and the youth services we're invested in. And that's why it's so important for us to have more facilities for young people to be kept busy. And you can go to the Our London website we've launched, and you can type in your postcode, Jack, and see some of the activities for your children so they can be kept busy this summer. I made this one point, James, which is important for me to say. Without wishing to excuse criminality, we've got to accept there is a link between deprivation, inequality, lack of opportunities, alienation, and violent crime. And I'm afraid all those things have been exacerbated over the last 16 months.
There's some splendid reporting in the Evening Standard at the moment into this issue, and one line stands out from Eliza Ribeiro, who founded Lives Not Knives. She said, when we ask young people aged 14 to 18 why they carry knives, they're nonchalant about it. Some don't believe their life matters. There's a sense of no hope, and so everything becomes in the moment. That question people ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? They don't seem to think about that. And this is systemic and generational. And after 6 years, there should be fewer kids on the streets of London feeling the way that this campaigner describes.
Yeah, and actually, the reason why what Elijah says is important, I was in Edmonton this week working with great youth workers there, working with young people there in performing arts, in music, including singing. And you saw an example there of the same sort of young children being involved in constructive things and doing wonderful things. So we can make a difference by providing good, safe facilities for young people to get busy. And by the way, those very same young people, had these facilities not been provided, would have been hanging around street corners, having a lack of hope, and having the sort of response that this campaigner talked about.
2 texts. And I'll go back to Jack briefly. Sadiq Khan, says Susan. Hi, James. Sadiq Khan has nothing new to say regarding knife crime. What he is saying now is just lip service. And this is unsigned. It says, you will never resolve this unless you tackle society's problems with poverty and systemic racism. Can you just respond briefly to both of those points?
Well, I think the second point deals with the comment made by Susan, which is my analysis as well. And I make this point about the 22 teenagers who lost their lives. 16 are black Londoners. When I talk about deprivation, poverty, alienation, lack of opportunities, it's the poorer communities where a disproportionate number of black people live. And that's one of the reasons why I do talk about structural inequalities. I do talk about structural racism. And one of the things we're doing in relation to the resources from City Hall around youth clubs, youth workers, mentoring, is we're focusing this on the deprived parts of London, the poorer parts of London, where I'm afraid a larger proportion of young black Londoners live.
Well, Jack's there. He's in Tower Hamlets. And that word visibility, Jack, are you seeing evidence of what the Mayor is describing?
When the cameras are on and the Commissioner and the Sadiq Khan come to Tower Hamlets, yes. When there's no cameras and I'm walking with my 6-year-old and 7-year-old to Victoria Park, I see gangs and gangs of teenagers up to no good and getting no education. There's no police. That's the scary thing. I live in it. I see. I grew up here. Yeah. If I went around for my kids, someone else would be threatening them. It's Sadiq. You've had 6 years. You know, and I don't think that's more than enough. First of all, I've seen other major cities, New York, deal with their violent youngsters and educate them. 6 years is a long time.
Well, I don't want like correcting listeners, Jack, but I tell you this: you look at the crime rates in New York. You don't want to live in New York. It took New York 20 years to make progress.
Necessarily want to live in London much
Well, actually, James, I've got to correct you there. As a global city, you compare London with any global city, we are safer. But also, Jack, I'm afraid in Tower Hamlets, and you can type in the Tower Hamlets postcode and the Our London website, you'll see some of the facilities we're providing. But Tower Hamlets is one of the examples of the boroughs where we're having an increased police presence to suppress violence, but also increased youth facilities to support young Londoners. And we have made progress over the last 5 years since I've been there on the metrics I've said: youth violence, knife crime, gun crime. But I'm not complacent.
So you've been re-elected. Jack's back here in 12 months' time, and the numbers are exactly the same. What will you say to him then? You can save him the cost of a phone call.
Yeah, well, Jack, in 12 months' time, we hope to see further progress on the progress we've already made, which is further progress on youth violence coming down, further progress on knife crime coming down, further progress on gun crime coming down. And by the way, we've also made good progress on burglaries coming down, on moped-enabled crimes coming down. But that's the context of the big concern this summer, which is the restrictions being eased and the summer holidays. So there will be increased police presence across London this summer, but also increased youth activities this summer as well.
So keep and peel, Jack, and rest assured I did register your criticism of me for not covering this issue on the programme as much as I used to do. So that has been registered as well very much. I'm just going to hang on. Jason in Wembley next, going straight through to the Mayor. Jason, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Morning, Jason.
Good morning, Sadiq. Can you tell me, I'm one of 18,000 bus drivers in London. We're out here sweating like pigs in our cabs. What are you going to do to help us with reinstating air conditioning on buses, because, yes, you do have fans on there, but they are just circulating the warm air that's going around inside the cab that's registering 34 plus degrees within the last 2 days.
Jason, let me take that away as soon as this programme finishes. The reason why the AC was turned off was because of the ventilation in relation to the virus. As you know, Jason, what we did was, I'm saying this for the other listeners, Jason, not you, I don't want to patronise you, is we closed the Perspex screen off, and we were worried about the ventilation because the virus was being passed from not just passengers to you, but also passengers to passenger. Let me go away and look into the heat in your cabin.
Pinging?
No, it's not.
It's not me.
The heat in. Let's go and look at the issue you raised. And what I'll do, Jason, is we'll get you details, James's production team, and I'll contact you directly. But separately, I'll make sure bus drivers are told what we're going to do to address this. If we can find a solution that deals with both the concerns around the virus, but also so you can have a decent cabin to drive in.
How bad is it, Jason?
It's bad enough that we are sweating, we are getting hot.
I get it.
Some drivers are actually getting fatigued. But one thing I do want to ask you, please involve the bus drivers here. You're talking to the operators of the 10 companies around London. You're not talking to us. We would love to sit down with you away from the operators and tell you what is really happening out here. Because I'll tell you now, you will not like what you hear. Because it is not just about air conditioning in cabs has been turned off for the last 2 years. The excuse we have is it burns fuel.
Yeah, let me reassure you, Jason, I don't just talk to the operators, I speak to the bus drivers as well, and separately we make sure that the operators talk to the drivers as well.
No, but he doesn't want the operators to talk to the drivers. He wants you to talk to the drivers.
Well, no, I know, James, but I can't speak to 27,000 bus drivers. What I can do is make sure that in addition to me speaking to...
You can speak to a few of them. You're speaking to one now.
James, let me answer Jason's question,
please.
All
right, go on.
What I'll do, Jason, is continue to make sure I engage with bus drivers, but also make sure that operators engage with bus drivers as well, bearing in mind that they're your employers. But I will take this issue away, Jason, and I'll make sure that both Heidi, the Deputy Mayor, and myself engage even more with bus drivers if you feel you're not being listened to.
Is it illegal that to be driving in that sort of heat?
Yeah, there's a temperature. So what it is, James, there is a health and safety legislation in relation to the highest temperature you should be working in and the lowest temperature you should be working in as well. But also, what Jason referred to as fatigue is really important. I'll give you an example. When it's hot, you get tired, right? And you can fall asleep.
Yeah.
Imagine a bus driver driving 20, 30, 40, 50 people falling asleep through no fault of his or her own because of the temperature in their cabin. And so, Jason, it is a serious issue you raise, and I promise you I'll take it away. I'd also ask for your to give James your number so we can personally ring you to reassure you. If you're not reassured, I'm happy to meet with you and/or Heidi to make sure it happens sooner rather than later.
And let me know if that doesn't happen.
Jason, let James know.
As ever, Jason. So give your number to.
I really appreciate ringing in there, Jason.
And thank you for what you're doing, you and your 18,000 colleagues, because it hadn't crossed my mind how hellish it would be. You're too busy wiping your brow as a passenger without thinking about how awful it must be.
Absolutely.
As a bus driver, don't you have a link with bus driver? I've just got some vague memory of you having some sort of.
I don't like talking about it much, Jason, because I'm quite shy about this, but my dad used to be a bus driver.
No, I never.
On a serious note, Jason, it is a serious point you raised, and I know often bus drivers are concerned about ringing in because they're concerned about the relationship they have with their operator, but I promise I'll take this away.
Okay. On with the calls.
The next caller is from Notting Hill, and it's Susanna. Good morning, Susanna.
Hi, Sadiq. And I know a lot of other people in London are very concerned about the persistently low rates of double vaccination in London. I mean, we're way behind the rest of the country, and in my borough, Kensington and Chelsea, the rate of double jabbing has been like 43%, and rates of vaccination are now falling off everywhere, apparently among the younger generation. Nadeem Zahawi said recently that you were going to have a big vaccine summit in London, with all health people, politicians, yourself, and so on. Could you please say what came out of the summit and is it producing any concrete results? Because quite honestly, as a vulnerable person, I feel more nervous about the pandemic, though I'm double vaccinated, than I have at any time since COVID started. you know.
There's a lot to cover there.
And I'm worried about the hospitals in London.
Yeah, let me do with...
Also, this dangerous thing, which I wanted to ask you about, perhaps you can tack it on the end to Susanna's question. And I think we fell into this trap. A lot of the media has, some of them perhaps quite deliberately. Instead of talking about the failure to tackle the virus properly or the Delta variant, there's a sense now that somehow it's all the app's fault that everybody's getting pinged left, right and centre. That is clearly a direct consequence of the sort of infection rates that Susanna is so concerned about, and her concern is exacerbated enormously by this vaccine stalling. It will take until October, I read this morning, to vaccinate all the under 30s. Demands for the jab has plummeted by 80% as the rollout slumps to its slowest pace yet. This was the one thing that the government got right. What's gone wrong?
Well, Susanna, let me try and deal with the various points, the really good points you raised, and also the various points James raised as well, which are also equally valid. So, look, the good news is actually the rollout has been a success, including in London. And so I'll give you some numbers, just to give you a sense of reassurance where we are in London. So more than 10 million doses have been administered in our city, more than 10 million. For those above the age of 40, more than 80% have had both jabs, and we're targeting the others who've not yet had both jabs. For those between 18 and 40, more than 80% have had one jab, and the others are in the queue to have their second jab because there's an 8-week time lag between the first jab and the second jab. Those aged between 18 and 30, more than 1 million have had the first jab. The reason why I'm throwing these numbers at you, Susanna, is because I take a direct interest on a daily basis in the vaccines rollout. And we're trying to encourage younger people, particularly those who are not registered with a GP, to have their jab by opening up the Tate on a Friday night, by having events at sports clubs, by having Battersea Arts Centre opened up, the Science Museum, and so forth. And over the course of the next few weeks, Susanna, we're working with nightclubs and others to have them as places where you can have a jab. As a global city, we are miles ahead of any global city, and I speak regularly to the mayors of Tokyo or Sydney or New York or elsewhere, because the challenge global cities have is a younger population, more diverse, more mobile, less likely to be registered with a GP, so more difficult to reach. And that's why we're doing whatever we can to try and reach those younger Londoners who may not be registered with a GP. And as I speak to you, every person in London above the age of 18 who's been registered with a GP has been contacted at least 3 times and an offer made. And I think, to give the government credit, James, and it's unlike me to do so, the vaccine rollout has been a humongous success, but it isn't mission accomplished. And that's why we've got to keep an eye on what you've just said, James, about a slowdown in the vaccine.
It's a big slowdown.
And this is one of the reasons why I've never used the phrase Freedom Day. Because when you use the phrase Freedom Day, it gives the impression we're liberated from this virus, and therefore there's no need to have the flu jab. And Susanna, the reason why the jab is so important is although we're having around 6,000 to 7,000 new cases a day, 6,000 to 7,000 new cases a day, thankfully, because of the high numbers of vaccine rollout, we're not having a commensurate increase in hospital population. And so when I tell you there's been 6,000 new cases a day in London, as I speak to you, there's roughly speaking 700 people in hospital with COVID, and roughly speaking 120 in ICUs. And that's because the vaccine is weakening the link between the virus and serious illness by around 90%. And that's why it's so important, for the reasons that you're concerned about, for us to continue to have the vaccine taken up by as many Londoners as possible.
You see what's happened in France, because you've registered your or your lack of support for the idea of vaccine passports to access areas. Macron announced it, and 44 million people signed up immediately. At one point, I think they were getting one application every 20 seconds. So that is fairly, and admittedly, there may be cultural differences or political differences between France and England, or France and London, but that's pretty impressive.
My concern about the government is the con. Let's be honest with people about why there's incentives. So if the reason, for example, to use a service is you've got to have a vaccine, let's be honest with people about the reason why we're doing this. My point is the inconsistency.
I don't understand this, which is, I'm sure, my fault. Well, can't you do both? Can't you say, if we do not reach vaccination level X by date Y, then we're going to have to introduce passports. And then if we don't reach it, we introduce them.
But that's not what the government said. I mean, maybe you should be advising the government about how to do communications. But that is a far more...
already nicking all my best lines.
But that is spot on, James.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's the sort of honest conversation we're going to have. Yeah.
Okay,
and I'll give you an example of that. Going on holiday.
Yeah.
A good example is we've been honest with people in the country saying, look, if you're going to go on holiday, you've got to have both jabs. And that's an honest conversation, treating people across the country as adults. And that's the sort of conversation we should be having with Londoners. Make this point, by the way.
So you would be in favour of passports in the context that I have just described?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's have a conversation with people about you.
And do you not have
services.
the right to do that in London anyway? I mean, TfL, I understand logistically would be impossible, but could you order nightclubs and hospitality venues to introduce something like that?
No, we couldn't. But one of the good things about nightclubs is, by and large, James, they're really responsible.
Sure.
They're working really closely with us in relation to opening up nightclubs as places to have a jab, because they realise that's where young people go. Similarly, councils have been really good working with restaurants, bars, live music, nightclubs in relation to issues around licensing and safety. And so we're doing what we can by using convening power, by having conversations, by education. And I think one of the problems is, in a crisis and a virus, confused messages helps nobody, and what you need is clarity.
Well, yes. Brilliant question here from Gary Burton. When was the last time you spoke to Boris Johnson?
A couple of weeks ago, briefly. Very, very cordial conversation, the most cordial conversation we've had for some time. And I'm hoping to meet him with the Prime Minister soon. One of the things I've sought to do after my re-election is said to the government, look, the election's out of the way now. Yeah. There's no reason for us to play party politics, and let's work close together, because it's in both of our interests, the government's and London's, for us to work collegially. And last week, for example, I met with the Home Secretary. Tomorrow I'm meeting with the Police Minister. I'm meeting with other ministers across government. And I think that's the mature, grown-up way for a government to work with the Mayor.
We've already kept you beyond the allotted time, so nobody's taken that opportunity to go straight to the front of the queue with a question about masks on public transport. So I shall ask you myself two things. Number one, I catch 2 tubes and usually 1 bus every day. Never, ever, 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 ever seen anybody checking or enforcing. And the second thing is, what do you have a date in mind for when you might actually lift the arguably not hugely effective insistence that people currently have to wear masks on public transport?
Okay, so before July the 19th, when wearing a face mask was part of a national requirement and national legislation, there were ostensibly 3 groups of people who would enforce wearing a face mask: the Met Police Service, British Transport Police, or TfL's own enforcement officers. One of the reasons I was keen to carry on the national requirement...
I've never seen... I know the plural of anecdote is not data, but I've never seen one intervention asking people to put a mask on when they're not.
Well, I mean, I can't respond to your personal experience except to say I'm sorry that you've not seen one.
I could turn it into a public experience by throwing open the phone lines if you want.
Well, I can, because the survey work we've done shows that, and the survey work's a bit old now, it's a month old now, is that 86% of people using public transport were wearing a face mask, and the 40% that weren't was because 2/3 were exempt. So I'll give you also other numbers.
Do you know how it's gone since Monday yet, or is it too early to tell?
It's too early. I mean, anecdotally from our enforcement officers and TfL staff, it's broadly the same this week as last week. But also, James, again, this is a bit dated now, but the sort of people that you've not seen had 212,000 conversations with commuters, which had led to 4,300 fixed penalty notices, 13,000 people being refused entry, and 3,000 being kicked off. Can I just deal with the second part of my answer, which is from the 19th of July, though, we can't use the police service.
No.
We can't use the British Transport Police. All we can use from the 19th of July are our enforcement officers. Why? Because it's not the law now, it's what's called a condition of carriage. And so basically...
How many enforcement officers have you got?
Just north of 400.
And how many people are travelling on the
so
moment,
my maths is a bit poor, but it's 45% of 4 million journeys a day,
so
and
70%
of 5 million bus journeys a day. So that's to give you an idea of
you've got 400 staff for several million journeys.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why
I'm not seeing any of them doing it.
That's one of the reasons why I was lobbying the government for a as indeed were mayors across the country of all parties, for a continuation of the national requirement. We are, though, James, looking into making the condition of carriage a bylaw. which should mean we'd be able to use police service and BTP as well.
Which suggests you're not planning on lifting it anytime soon.
I beg your pardon. And so we'll keep it under review. I can't give you a date when we'd lift it as a condition of carriage, because the advice I receive is the virus will be here for some time. And all I say to your listeners who don't like wearing a face mask is, I'm sorry, it is an inconvenience, but it's the precautionary principle, because 1 out of 3 of us who may have the virus won't realise we've got it. There are no symptoms being shown. And the good news actually is the research that's more than a year old that showed that wearing a face mask really does reduce the chance of you passing the virus on if you've got it. Latest research from America, from the Centre for Disease Control, shows it also may help you not catching the virus if you're wearing the face mask. So aside from the inconvenience, there are very few downsides to wearing a face mask unless you're exempt for a good reason.
Could it still be here this time next year?
So one of the things when I speak to mayors across the globe, is speak to the mayors in the Far East. Think of the Tokyos, the Singapores, the Malaysias. They wear face masks as a matter of course, because they've had experience of SARS, of other viruses and so forth. And so that's a good question. I'm not sure, because culturally it's very different in Western countries. I think it'll be a personal choice. It depends.
Do you think you'll carry on wearing one as a personal choice, long beyond you were required to?
Yeah, I mean, I've never
actually.
I always carry a face mask with me, and when the kids and my wife, we leave home, we always make sure we've got one. It's the keys, the wallet, and a face mask now. Yeah. So I think for the foreseeable future,
and your phone. Don't forget your phone.
The phone never leaves me. But the reason why it's important, James, sorry, can I make this other point, which is really serious, is this virus is going to mutate and evolve, and as winter comes, I'm concerned about the virus evolving and mutating. So I think for the rest of this year, I think face masks will probably be here in some form or another. That's why it's so important that we try and get used to it as much as we can.
Sadiq Khan, many thanks indeed. And I think unofficially it's become a 45-minute segment this rather than a 30-minute segment. So thank you for your patience. And we'll see you in a month.
Stay safe.
And you. It's just gone 10:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
This is LBC. Well.